whatever happens in Abu Dhabi, whatever happens with the potential of peace or further war in Ukraine, the task of identifying these thousands of unknown soldiers will persist for years and years to come.
The US, Russia and Ukraine will meet for trilateral talks today. Whatever the outcome, the reality is that for so far more than 1.5 million soldiers have been killed or injured in the war, and 150,000 remain missing. In a new documentary for The Times, special correspondent Anthony Loyd travels to Ukraine to meet families still searching for answers and the forensic teams working to identify the missing. Morning to you, Anthony.
Hello, Chloe.
I watched your film last night and it is just so stark and so powerful, just in getting a vague idea of the struggle that so many Ukrainian families are going through right now for answers about their missing loved ones.
Chloe, so I think part of the story that I've tried to tell working with the videographer Federica de Correa is not just about grief and loss and violence and the violence of the war, but just the scale of it and the scale of the problem of missing soldiers. And the film is very much to do with the families of missing soldiers and the bodies of soldiers that have been found in no man's land and attempts to identify them. So just to give you an idea of the size of the problem, at the moment, the International Committee for the Red Cross, the ICRC, are trying to locate 192,000 missing people in the war in Ukraine. More than 90% of that figure is missing soldiers, Ukrainian and Russian. So that means that scores of thousands of soldiers have gone missing on each side along the 800-mile-long front line. Some of them are dead and have been recovered and their bodies lie in morgues and they haven't yet been identified because there's all sorts of problems with the identification process. And some of them are still lying churned in the mud or disassembled. But the problem involves thousands and thousands of soldiers, as I say, probably nearly 192,000 soldiers and their families. And for the families of Ukrainians whose men have gone to, largely men, some women too, have gone to defend their land and then gone missing, their fate is unknown. Could they be in a Russian prison camp? For a very few, possibly. Will they ever get the body of their loved one back, or can a body ever be identified as that of their loved one? So that was what we set out to do in this film, and working particularly with the main forensic team in the south, Odessa, who have set up a huge morgue, an improvised morgue at a rail yard, dealing with 2,500 bodies of Ukrainian soldiers, which is just a small proportion of the overall number that are missing.
Tell us about the families you met.
We met three principal families, and they were people who we'd sought out and contacted through social media. And obviously, we were very delicate in the way we made our approaches, but they really wanted to speak. So one was a woman called Anna, who had been with her husband, a vassal, for a long time, more than 10 years marriage. And then he went missing. He sent her a message. A lot of these soldiers have mobile phones, which they can use right up until the moment they go missing. So she knew that he'd been in action, knew the Russians were close, then lost all contact. She clings to the hope that he is still alive, and she goes through particularly Russian telegram sites which post a lot of footage of obviously dead Ukrainian soldiers and soldiers lying on the battlefield, in the hope either of identifying her husband or learning if perhaps he might be a prisoner of war. So that was one. She said it's very important for her to get involved in the process of trying to identify, even on social media, what's happened to her husband, because it's better than doing nothing. Then we spoke to a lovely young guy called Vadim, who was very close to his dad, who'd gone missing nearly 2 years ago. Same deal. He heard from his dad. Then some other soldiers came back and he said that his dad had been wounded in the leg, requested evacuation. It was during the attack. They couldn't evacuate him. Nothing more was heard. And he described the impact on his family. He said, every day I wake up and the first thing I think is my dad is missing. We don't know, is he dead or alive? He kind of accepted. He said, it'll be a miracle if my dad is still alive. But the impact on his family, he said, my dad was the centerpin of our family. He was the spirit and the kind of soul and got things done. And now the core of our family has been removed, and we haven't got a body to grieve over. We don't know for sure if dad's dead or if he's in prison. So there were those two. And then we met up with a family whose father had just been identified. A very ravaged body held in a morgue in Dnipro had finally, after a year and a half, got a DNA match. That's part of the identification process, obviously. And for them, they've been caught in the kind of limbo between hope and anxiety, not knowing what had happened to their dad. And then finally they get a DNA match so they can bury him. And that kind of, their emotions change then to very much to grief. The process is very challenged, not just by the sheer scale of the number of soldiers killed and the number of bodies unidentified of soldiers in morgues, but by the fact Ukraine didn't have a centralized DNA base for its army before the full-scale invasion. It set one up last year, but it's still in quite a nascent stage. And also, it's still not common for Ukrainian soldiers to wear dog tags, ID tags. So a lot of the bodies don't have any identification documents on them at all. And whatever happens in Abu Dhabi, whatever happens with the potential of peace or further war in Ukraine, the task of identifying these thousands of unknown soldiers will persist for years and years to come.
Anthony, it's a really powerful film and one that I do urge people to watch. It's difficult to watch, but it's really, really important that it gives us an insight into what families are going through in Ukraine. I want to ask you before we let you go about Syria, because there's footage showing fighting in some of the prison camps, including the facility which is holding the former British citizen Shamima Begum. People remember that she was having her British citizenship stripped from her. What is happening and potentially what does that mean for Shamima Begum on the ground?
Like, just to step back, so there's a lot more at stake in northeastern Syria right now than just for Shamima Begum. The coalition, particularly Britain and America and France's main allies in the fight against Islamic State there, the Syrian Kurds, and their force, the SDF, have been effectively routed over the last few days by the Syrian government forces under President al-Sharaa. There's 2 more days of a ceasefire to run, but the SDF, the Kurds, have lost a lot of ground, a lot of territory. If things get worse, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of people on the move and thousands dead, and possibly the worst upsurge of violence since Assad was overthrown a year and a half ago. But what that means for people held in the camps, through 2 main camps, Al-Hol, which is about 24,000 people in, and with which they're women and children. It's not a prison, it's a detention camp, that's for sure. About 8,000 of those are foreigners. Then you've got Roj camp, also in the northeast. It's got about 2,500 people, including Shamima Begum, and probably 36 British citizens, all women and children. I think it's extremely likely that Shamima Begum will be freed either very soon or this year, because I'm absolutely sure that President al-Sharaa's forces, originally, including in their number Al-Qaeda fighters, will take over control of those camps. I mean, I think that's an absolute given. That's going to happen within the next few days. And certainly his men will regard it, unless they're paid or pressurized by the West not to do so, to release a whole lot of those women and children, because they won't see a particular reason to keep them in what's effectively a kind of detention camp where they've been held since 2019. It's important to remember that many of those children weren't even born in 2019. They've been born in a camp, and there's not a great deal of use to keeping those children in those camps any longer. They get radicalised there. Many of the women had very little agency or choice in going to Syria in the first place. In Shamima Begum's case, I would think it's likely she would be freed this year, perhaps within the next few weeks. I think it's very unlikely she would ever be able to come back to the UK. I just think her future will lie in Syria or perhaps southern Turkey.
Something we'll continue to keep an eye on, and certainly with you, Anthony. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That is the Times special correspondent Anthony Loyd. To watch his film on Ukraine, and I really would urge you to do so, go to thetimes.com and you can watch it there.